Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining me. I'm here in the reading room. Surprise! I know. I was supposed to be in the other room, the philosophical room, classroom, but I really am not ready. I'm not ready to do it, and I want to talk about this. I found it to be one of the most interesting topics was moral disengagement, and I want to do it justice. And I worked so long on the Bookless classroom that I didn't have enough time to work on this and give it a proper introduction. So instead, we're going to jump here. Tomorrow, we're going to do the, we're not normally scheduled to do the philosophical classroom. We're going to do the philosophical classroom tomorrow. Look at this. All of this sequence all over the place that's coming off of this dress. It's like, what did they do? Did they just simply stick it on? Like, just, there it is. It's, look at this. Oh, wait, here's some more. Look at that. Look at this. Okay. What we found is that Alyssa found her brothers, but they were swans. Right? The eldest brother explained, we fly as wild swans when the sun stays in the sky. When it disappears, we become human again. So we have to be careful always to be on land at sunset. If we were flying, we would fall to our deaths. We don't live here, but in a country just as beautiful as this on the other side of the ocean, a great distance from here. There are no islands on the way where we can spend the night, except for a lonely little rock sticking up in the middle of the sea. It is only large enough for us to stand side by side to rest. If the sea is rough, water sprays over us, but we thank God for it. Otherwise, we could never visit our dear fatherland. We use the 2 longest days of the year to make our flight and can stay only 11 days. Here we fly over the castle where we were born and where Father lives, and over the church tower where Mother is buried. It seems as if the bushes and trees are our family as well as the wild horses that run over the plains. The gypsies sing the old songs we danced to as children. We are drawn to come here once a year, and now we have found you, our dear little sister. We dare to stay only 2 days longer before we can fly away again. But how can we take you with us? We have neither ship nor boat. How can I deliver you from this curse? Asked Alyssa. That night they talked for hours, sleeping very little. You can imagine, right, how brothers and sisters would be planning for something that was big and exciting, right? Getting back together. Alyssa was awakened by the sound of swan wings rushing above her. The brothers flew in a circle and at last flew away, but the youngest of them stayed behind. He laid his head on Alyssa's lap, and she stroked his white wings. They were together all day until the others returned. When the sun set, the swans were men again. Tomorrow we shall fly away and not return for a whole year, but we could never leave you behind. Do you have the courage to go with us? If the arms of one of us are strong enough to carry you through the forest, shouldn't our wings be strong enough together to carry you over an ocean? Yes, take me with you, exclaimed Alyssa. They spent the whole night braiding a large, strong net of soft reeds and willow bark. Alyssa fell asleep upon it, and when the sun rose and the brothers were changed to wild swans, they took the net in their beaks and flew high into the clouds with their sleeping sister. The sunbeams fell on her face, so one of the swans flew over her head and spread the wings above her for shade. They were far from land when Alyssa woke up. She thought she was still dreaming, for it seemed so strange to be carried high through the air over the ocean. Beside her lay a branch with delicious ripe berries and a bunch of sweet-smelling roots that the youngest brother had gathered for her. She smiled thankfully to him, for she knew it was the one who had flown over her head and shaded her with his wings. They were so high that the first ship they saw beneath them looked like a seagull sitting on the water. The cloud behind them resembled a huge mountain, and Alyssa watched the shadows of herself and her 11 brothers fly across it like giants. It was a sight more wonderful than any she had ever seen before, but as the sun grew higher and the cloud farther behind them, the moving shadow picture disappeared. There they are carrying her. Isn't that awesome? All day long they flew as an arrow rushing through the air. Actually, they were slower than usual since they had their little sister to carry. Evening grew close, and Alyssa watched the sun sink with fear in her heart. The lonely rock in the ocean was not to be seen, and the swans were beating their wings harder and harder. Alyssa felt it was her fault that they had not made better time. She prayed in desperation, but still she didn't spy the rock. Black clouds closed in around them. Strong gusts of wind foretold a storm. Lightning flashed against the sky again and again. The sun was now on the edge of the sea, and Alyssa's heart trembled. Suddenly, the swans dove downward, and she thought they were falling until they began to glide again. When the sun was halfway beneath the horizon, she spied the little rock beneath them. It looked so large than a seal pup sticking his head up above the waves. It looked no larger than a seal pup sticking his head above the waves. The sun sank quickly until it was only a star. Then her foot touched the ground. The last spark of the sun went out like a bit of burning paper. Arm in arm, her brothers stood around her as the sea beat against the rock. The heavens were shining like fire, and the thunder rolled. Alyssa and her brothers held hands and sang a psalm that comforted them and encouraged them. At dawn, the air was quiet. As soon as the sun rose, the swans flew again with Alyssa. The ocean was still rough. From high in the air, the white foam on the black-green waves looked like millions of floating swans. As the sun grew higher, Alyssa saw before her a mountainous land crowned by shining ice caps. In the center, a mile-long castle with one intricate pillar after another stood above a beach of waving palm trees and flowers as large as mill wheels. She asked if that were the country for which they were heading, but the swans shook their heads. What she saw was the morning princess's constantly changing castle of clouds. The swans did not dare to bring a human there. As Alyssa stared at it, the mountains crumbled and the castle collapsed, and their place stood 12 proud churches, and in their place stood 12 proud churches exactly alike, with high towers and pointed windows. She thought she heard an organ chiming, but it was only the ocean. When they approached, the churches took on the appearance of a fleet of ships sailing below, but it was really the ocean fog rolling over the water. Before her eyes, everything was eternally changing. Then Alyssa saw the real land. They came upon a lovely blue mountain covered by cedar forests, villages, and castles. Long before the sun went down, she sat on the mountainside in front of a large cave overgrown with green vines. It looked like an embroidered tapestry. Now we shall see what you will dream of tonight, said the youngest brother as he showed her to her sleeping chamber. If only I might dream of how I could rescue you, she answered. The thought of it captivated her mind and heart. She prayed earnestly to God for help and kept on praying as she fell asleep. It seemed to her that she flew through the air to the castle of the morning princess, where a beautiful, glittering fairy met her. The fairy resembled the old woman who had given her berries in the forest and told her about the 11 swans wearing golden crowns. Your brothers can be rescued, she promised, but do you have courage and endurance? The ocean is softer than your hands and yet can transform the hardest stones. But it does not feel the pain your fingers will feel. It has no heart and does not suffer the fear and anxiety which you must endure. Do you see these nettles I hold in my hand? We learned about nettles in the early bird classroom. There are many such nettles growing around the cave where you are sleeping. Only these and the ones growing in churchyards are usable. Although they will sting until blisters appear. I've got leaves like that with those stingers on the end. You must pick the nettles and crush them in your feet with your feet into flax. Then knit 11 long-sleeved shirts. When you throw these shirts over the 11 swans, the curse will be broken. But remember, from the moment you begin the task until it is finished, though years may pass, you may not speak. The first word you say will drive a knife into your brothers' hearts. The lives of your brothers depend upon your tongue. The fairy touched Alyssa's hand with nettles that stung like little flames, and Alyssa woke up. It was daylight, and close beside her lay a nettle like the one she had seen in the dream. She fell on her knees, gave thanks to the Lord, and went outside to begin her work. Her delicate hands grabbed the stinging nettles. They burned like fire and blistered her hands and arms. She suffered the pain gladly, however, thinking only of salvation for her dear brothers. She crushed each nettle with her bare feet and spun green twine from them. When the sun went down, her brothers returned to the cave and were frightened at finding Alyssa so silent. They thought it must be due to a new curse of the evil stepmother, but when they saw her hands, they understood that what she was doing was for their sake. The youngest brother cried, and where his tears fell, the pain and blisters disappeared. All night long, Alyssa worked, for she would never have peace of heart before she had set her brothers free. All the next day, while the swans were away, she sat alone. My time had never flown so quickly. She finished one shirt and began on the next. Suddenly, the horn of the group of hunters rang through the mountains, like that. Alyssa grew afraid as the sound of barking dogs came closer. She hurried into the cave, tying the nettles she had gathered into a bundle. At that moment, a large dog jumped out of the thicket, followed by another and another. They barked loudly, running back and forth. Before long, the hunters stood before the opening of the cave. The most handsome among them was the king. He stepped over Alyssa. Never had he seen a more beautiful girl. Lucy, where are you? Stay over here. Lucy. What are you doing here, you lovely child? He asked. Alyssa shook her head. She dared not speak, for the lives of her brother depended on it. She hid her hands under the apron so the king would not see how she suffered. Follow me, he commanded. You must not stay here. If you are as sweet and as beautiful as you are, beautiful, I will have you dressed in silk and velvet and have a golden crown set on your head. You shall live in my regal palace. He lifted Alyssa up on his horse as she cried and wrung her hands, but the king explained, I only want to make you happy. One day you will thank me for it. And he rode away between the mountains, holding her in front of him on the horse. The other hunters followed behind them. As the sun set, a majestic city with its churches and towers came into sight. The king led Alyssa into the palace, where a large water fountain splashed in the lofty marble room. Both the walls and ceiling were covered with paintings. Lucy! Lucy! But the walls and ceiling were covered with paintings. Both the walls and ceiling were covered with paintings, but Alyssa did not see them, for she was crying in sorrow. Passively, she allowed the woman to dress her in royal robes, braid pearls into her hair, and pull dainty gloves over her blistered fingers. When she finally appeared in all her majesty, she was so ravishingly beautiful that the court bowed deeply before her, and the king proposed to make her his bride. But the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the beautiful girl from the woods was probably a witch who had blinded their eyes and bewitched the heart of the king. Why does he have to be so nasty talking about her like that? So nasty. The king didn't listen to him. He commanded that the music chime that there be feasting and dancing for Alyssa. that the music chime, that there be feasting and dancing for Alyssa. He led Alyssa through the fragrant gardens and great rooms of the palace. However, not a smile crossed Alyssa's lips, nor shone from her eyes. There was only sorrow painted upon her face. Then the king showed her to a small chamber decorated with green carpets and wallpaper. It resembled the cave where he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of twine she had spun from the nettles, and from the ceiling hung her finished shirt. The hunters had taken it with them as a curiosity. Here you can dream yourself back to your former home, said King. Here is the task that kept you busy. In the splendor of the palace, it may amuse you to think back on your past. When Alyssa saw that which was so dear to her heart, a smile played about her lips, and the blood returned to her cheeks. She thought again of the salvation of her brothers and kissed the hands of the king as he drew her to his heart. All the church bells rang out, proclaiming the wedding celebration. The lovely, silent girl from the woods was to become the queen. The archbishop whispered evil words into the ear of the king, but they did not penetrate his heart. The wedding was to take place, and the archbishop himself was to set the crown on her head. He pressed the crown harshly upon her forehead until it hurt, but her sorrow over her brothers hurt far more. Alyssa did not speak, but her eyes glowed with deep love for the good and handsome king, who did all he could to make her happy. She became more and more fond of him, if only she dared to confide in him and tell him why she suffered. But silent she must remain. Silently she must fulfill her task. At night she quietly left his side, went into her chamber, and knitted one shirt after another. When she began the seventh, she ran out of twine. The nettles she needed grew in the churchyard, but how could she dare to go out to gather them? Oh, what is the pain in my fingers compared to that in my heart, she thought. I must take the risk. The Lord will not fail me. With fear in her heart, as if it were an evil deed she was planning, she slipped out into the moonlight night, through the long winding alleys, out onto the lonesome streets and toward the churchyard. When she arrived, she saw a group of hideous witches sitting on one of the gravestones. They took their tattered clothes off, and with long, lean fingers dug down into the earth. Alyssa had to pass close by them as they fastened their eyes upon her. But she whispered a prayer, gathered the nettles, and carried them back to the palace. Let's see, where are we? Only one person had seen her, the archbishop. Now he was confirmed in his suspicion that she was a witch who had deceived the king and the court. The following day he told the king from the confession booth what he had seen and what he feared. And when the hard words fell from his tongue, the carved statues of the saints shook their head as if they wanted to say, "It is not so, Alyssa is innocent." But the archbishop explained it as if they meant to bear witness against her, shaking their heads at her shame. 2 heavy tears rolled down the king's cheeks. He went home with misgiving in his heart and only pretended to sleep that night. He noticed that Alyssa got up out of bed and disappeared into her green chamber. She repeated this each of the following nights, and each time he secretly followed her. Day by day, the king's expression became darker. Alyssa saw it, but didn't understand why. It worried her, and she worried as well for her brothers. Her salty tears fell on the royal purple velvet and glittered like diamonds. Everyone who saw this exquisite sight envied the queen. Soon Alyssa would be finished with her task. Only one shirt remained to be made, but she had no more twine and not a single nettle. Once again, for the last time, she would have to go to the courtyard and pick more of them. She remembered fearfully the lonely walk and the frightful witches, but her will was set, as was her confidence in the Lord. As Alyssa left the palace, the king and the archbishop followed after and watched her disappear through the gate into the churchyard. When they drove closer, When they drew closer, they saw the witches as Alyssa had seen them. The king turned his face away, for he imagined that his beloved, whose head had rested upon his chest that very evening, was going to join their company. The people must judge her, he exclaimed, and the people declared, she shall be burned at the stake. From the splendid palace, she was led into a dark, damp cell where the wind whistled through the barred windows. Instead of velvet and silk, she was given the bunch of nettles she had gathered for a pillow, and the stiff burning shirts she had knitted for a blanket, but nothing more precious could have been given to her. She took up her task again as she prayed to God. Outside, the boys in the streets sang mocking songs about her. Not a soul comforted her with a single kind word. At the close of the day, a swan wing appeared in the barred window. It was the youngest of her brothers who had found his sister. She jumped in joy because she knew that although the coming night was to be her last, her brothers would be close by as her task was nearly finished. The archbishop came to be with Alyssa the last hour of her life, just as he had promised the king. But Alyssa shook her head at him and begged in sign language to be left alone. Tonight she must finish work, or everything would be in vain. The pain, the tears, the sleepless nights. The archbishop left with evil words about her, but the poor Alyssa knew she was innocent and remained at her task. Little mice ran over the floor and helped her by dragging the nettles to her feet. The thrush perched at the window bars, singing bravely throughout the night to keep her courage up. At dawn, less than an hour before the sunrise, Alyssa's brothers stood at the gates of the palace and demanded to be led before the king. They were refused permission on the grounds that the king could not be disturbed. They begged and they threatened until the king himself came out, but at that moment the sun rose and Alyssa's brothers were no longer there. The king only saw 11 wild swans flying low over the palace. Townspeople streamed through the city gates, intending to see the burning of the witch. A scraggly old horse pulled the cart upon which she sat. She was dressed in rough sackcloth. Sackcloth, it's burlap. And her lovely long hair hung loose around her beautiful face. Her cheeks were deathly pale, but her lips moved gently as her fingers continued to knit the green twine. Even on the way to her death, she refused to give up her task. 10 shirts lay at her feet as she worked on the 11th. The crowd jeered. Look at that witch. See how she mumbles. She carries no psalmbook in her hand, but only her gruesome witchcraft. Tear it from her hands and into 1,000 pieces. The crowd pressed close to the cart and would have grabbed the nettle shirt, but the 11 swans appeared and flew at them. The swans sat around Alyssa on the cart and flapped their powerful wings, forcing the mob to the side. It is a sign from heaven. She must be innocent, whispered many, but they dared not say it aloud. As the executioner grabbed Alyssa by the hand, she quickly threw the 11 shirts over the swans. Suddenly, in their places stood 11 princes. The youngest, however, had a swan wing instead of an arm, for Alyssa had not had time to finish the last sleeve of his shirt. Now I will speak, Alyssa cried out. I am innocent. The people who watched what had happened kneeled before her as before a saint, but Alyssa sank lifeless into the arms of her brothers. The fear, worry, and pain had taken its toll on her. Yes, she is innocent, shouted the oldest brother. He told everything that had happened, and while he spoke, a fragrance floated through the air. It was like the perfume of 1,000,000 roses, for every piece of kindling at the stake had taken root and sent forth branches until it had become a sweet-smelling hedge covered with red roses. At the top, a single white flower bloomed, shining and radiant as a star. The king picked it and laid it on Alyssa's breast. She woke up with peace and happiness in her heart. All the church bells started ringing by themselves, and birds flew around in large flocks, escorting the procession back to the castle. It was more festive than any king had ever seen. That's it. We finished the book in 2 readings. I love it. The Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen. Such beautiful language that he told that story. I like that story better than Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, don't you? It's different, though. It's very different. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We're in the reading room. I didn't tell you that. This is the reading room, and we just finished a wonderful story, The Wild Swans. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I'm the teacher. You're here in the classroom. Thanks for joining.